Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. We hope it's worth the price of admission you paid, which is not a high bar for us, so that's a good thing. So let me just begin by thanking Carrie for organizing this program and also for her meticulous editing of the book.
And John Claude.
John Claude.
And John Claude for that.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Other stuff.
For the technology,
Stuff.
which we're obviously inept at. We also want to thank Diane, Lindsay, Law Fearon, Al Malput, and Sam Cooper for their comments and suggestions throughout our research process. It was really helpful. And finally, we want to thank the Community Foundation of Middlesex County for a grant that partially funded the cost of this project. And hopefully in the spring, a dramatic version of this. It'll be our third time, and I hope the third time is a charm for that. So stay tuned for that. All right, so I want to begin by just kind of setting the mood. I want you to imagine Chester in the 1860s, a time we associate with sepia-tone images, dirt roads, and horse-drawn buggies. New England is in the process of transitioning from an agricultural to an industrial economy, so the clamor of water-powered factories echoes throughout the town, and the smell of wood smoke permeates the air. On the national stage, rumblings of political upheaval centering on the issue of slavery filled the papers, but that all seems very far away. Until suddenly, the war of rebellion erupts, tearing the country asunder. To young men like Willis Ayres and his friends, the lure of adventure is irresistible. And so they enlist in the Army and head south for what promises to be the greatest experience of their lives. But they cannot imagine the horrors they will witness, and some will not return. Meanwhile, family members back at home, like Willis's sister Nancy, try their best to maintain a sense of normalcy. They go about their daily routines, but trips to the post office take on greater urgency as they await letters from loved ones. It is our great fortune that some of the correspondence between Willis and Nancy has survived, as has Nancy's diary, and the display case over here, you certainly should take a look before you leave, and Rob has made a couple of displays showing these items. You know, when you see them and you see especially the diary for me made a huge impression. It's, you know, small handwriting in pencil, and when you hold that in your hand, you really feel, you know, the presence of that these were real people actually doing this, people not different than us.
And the same is true for the letters.
And the same is true from the letters. But to me, the diary was particularly, you know, poignant in that regard.
And everything in the case is actual. It's not facsimile.
So as stewards of these precious documents, which we've had in our possession now for about 30 years, and Rob will give some details, you know, it took us a while to decide what to do with it. And, you know, we didn't take lightly the issue of publicizing them because, after all, these were personal writings, personal reminiscences, correspondence with family members, and in the diary, the case of the diary, probably not to be read by anyone else. And so, you know, the idea of intruding on their privacy in that way, we didn't take it lightly, but we decided that the passage of time and the great historical value of these documents weighed in the direction of publicizing them, and so we decided to do that. And we hope that, you know, that they enlighten us and educate us about what everyone was experiencing in this momentous time in our town and our country's history. So let me now turn it over to Rob to talk about the provenance of these items and how he, you know, discovered them. So, please.
Well, if anybody knows me well enough, they know that I'm a scrounge and that I love old things. And that all started with my grandmother's house, basically, which was the house she grew up in and lived in from about 1908 for the rest of her life, and now my sister lives in the house. But it was a source of amazing family treasures, and I really didn't get involved in care much about larger history until I connected it to our local history. But anyway, so when I was in my 20s, that was probably the most active time of my scrounging in her house, because she was available for me to, you know, ask. I find it funny to, you know, please laugh. Anyway, so I would, she'd go off on a weekend or something, I'd attack the house and go find things, and then when she got back, I'd say, tell me about this, tell me about this. So, in her bedroom, and you're gonna think this is strange, because, well, it is. But anyway, in her bedroom.
But not knowing him, it's not strange.
That's true. In her bedroom, she had, now again, this is the house that she grew up in. Her bedroom was her parents' bedroom. Furniture and everything was the same. And so in her bedroom was what she had turned into a vanity table, but it was literally, it was a commode. And for the younger people in here, a commode is not a bathroom, but it's where your toiletries were kept. It was where your chamber pot for the bed was kept. So it had drawers, and it wasn't water. There was no water involved, and so it wasn't like a sink or anything. So it was just like a little dresser. And typical of things in my grandmother's house, all through the house, the 20th century things, late 20th century things, mid 20th century things, were in the front of drawers. In the back of drawers, the further back you went, same as true of closets, the further back you went, you found older and older and older. So in the top drawer of this.
So it's like drawer archaeology.
Oh, exactly.
The strata,
Yeah, you peel the layers back. So in the top drawer of the commode, in the front of the drawer were her, the pink clip-on curlers.
Getting a little personal here, aren't we?
Well, that's why, it's just, the juxtaposition of these two things is just, to me amazing. And that's, part of the fun of this story. So in the front were the pink clip-on curlers, and then in the back, you go further back. And in the back of the very same drawer with those curlers was a bundle of letters tied together with a string. And so, of course, I needed to know who they were from and, what they were all about. So I opened them up, and of course, they were these Civil War letters from, and anyway, the picture that you see, there's a connection here. The picture that you see is Annie Jewell. That's our great-grandmother. And it was her commode to begin with. It was her bedroom to begin with. And she is most probably the source of how those letters got to our side of the family. The letters were from her, now I know this by like the back of my hand, but when I'm standing in front of people talking, I forget. These were her
uncle and aunt,
her aunt and uncle, her mother's brother and sister. And we're going to get into more of their family later, but these letters passed down through Nancy to her, probably directly to her, not her mother, because her mother died soon after.
Tree yet or not?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess we'll go there. So, Annie Jewell, well, it starts at the top with the Dickinson and Ayers family, and there were 5 children that lived. There were 2 other children that died in childhood. And so you see Willis is the oldest. He was born in 1835. There was Hubert in the middle, and he died at 10. Oh, there was actually only one other one. I forgot Hubert was up there. There was a girl that died between Nancy and Willis. And then Nancy, Hannah, Henry. Hannah is our great-great-grandmother. She married William Henry. Annie Jewell is their child. That's our great-grandmother. And then Evelyn is our grandmother. And so that's whose house these letters were found in. And it was in the 1980s.
So before we pass away from this, so Nancy Dickinson, that is indeed the Dickinson family from Amherst. So they are related to Emily Dickinson.
And Essex.
As are we, yes.
Same family. Huge family. So one of the other sources that we have of information, other than through the letters, through family just talking, is this man here, who's our great-great-uncle George. This is Annie Jewell's brother. And he was, this picture was taken in front of what was the town office building in the center of town in 1952 or 3 or something. He was the first selectman in town. But Cousin Helen Rafuse, many of you know Cousin Helen Rafuse. Helen Rafuse was one of the first people in town to do oral histories. And so she did an oral history taping Uncle George in 1972 when he was 94 years old. And he is And so he was telling about, it was his aunt and uncle also. And he was telling, you know, so there were a lot of things he told us, or he left in this oral history, which is amazing. And so, can I talk about accent now?
Go ahead.
Okay,
Please
so,
do.
so listening to Uncle George talk, now he died in 1973, I think. It was soon after the tape was taken. He was, for a couple years, and I don't know if you know what year he died. I can't remember, but it was in the mid to early 70s. Anyway, if you listen to him talking on this tape, you would swear that he was from Maine, because he had what we think of as a Maine accent, yet he was born in Chester, spent his entire life in Chester, and had this amazing Maine accent.
So I interpret that, again, language is a way you can trace history, and linguists do this all the time, and they use linguistics to establish lineages and so on. And to me, this is revealing that probably in Chester in the 1860s, people spoke like they had Maine accents. It's very likely. And our Aunt Isabel, Evelyn's sister, had a slight Maine accent. Some of the words and intonations she used were accented in that way. And so it has faded, of course, but the other thing I'll say about George, we met him as children. We would go there trick-or-treating or whatever. So he was and I think we went and saw him
I only remember seeing him in Chesterfield.
the convalescent, yeah. So we went to his house, which is top of Pleasant Street. And the striking thing to me, as I thought about that as an adult, and we were doing this, and so people talk about degrees of separation from either people or historic events or whatever. So he was the son of a Civil War veteran, and we met him. So we are 1 degree separated from a Civil War veteran, which was 160 years ago. And so living people, it's not as far back as, we ordinarily think. We're losing all of the World War II veterans now. There's very few of them left. This is 100 years before that. And to me, it's fascinating that I feel like I could say I have 1 degree of separation from a Civil War veteran. Just a side note.
I think that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about, just as a way of background, Chester in the 1860s. So Rob can tell you about this photograph. Why don't you do that first before I start?
I believe it was Willie Schaefer that found this photograph, maybe in the late 90s. I can't remember what year it was, but if anybody remembers the provenance, that I thought it was part of a stereopticon. Saucy, is that true? Does that sound right?
Yes.
And so this is, as far as I know, and again, Diane can comment on this, but as far as I know, this is the earliest outdoor photograph of Chester. There are obviously portraits of people, as we have from our relatives, but this is supposed to be around 1868. And now Tommy and I, this is from the top of this hill, just below the cemeteries, looking toward the center of town. Now Tommy and I went during the last winter and sort of looked to see if we could, sort of place and see how much of this you can still see. And it was amazing how you can't. Even with no leaves on the trees, you can't, but you can still see some very specific places. The Greek revival, what was Zanardi's, and is now, I forgot their name, Margaret Matthews' house. You can see Bessie Tyler Emmons' house, which I don't know who lives there now. But you can see the hotel in the center of town obviously before either fire, the one that took the pitch roof, the peak roof off, the one that took the flat roof off. So you can see that. And Karen, where are you? I know you're here somewhere. Karen, I don't know if I've had a chance to say this to you, but your grandfather's house in the center of town, I have to point to it.
Doing those little.
One story?
Yeah, because that was originally a cape. This is what was Archambault Insurance and now is Smith Insurance.
Oh.
And when I realized that, long after I saw this photograph for the first time, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, there it is, the Shaler house, when the Shalers are the ones that raised it up. And apparently they raised it up and built a floor underneath. They didn't just take the roof off. And but that's one of the most fascinating things about this picture. But the other thing is was known as Hearst House Hill, because just below the cemetery, on the west side was a hearse house that held the horse-drawn hearse. And here you can see sort of the tracks of the hearse, which is kind of neat. But anyway, I love this photograph. So anyway, 1868, so this is just after the time of these letters.
All right, so back to the script. So on the eve of the Civil War, the population of Chester, according to the census, was just over 1,000. And as I had mentioned earlier, the Industrial Revolution was sweeping through New England, and so the two branches of the Pattacon Brook that ran through town had become home to numerous small-scale factories and shops, producing a wide array of products, more than you can imagine for a small town, including wood-turned items, brushes, textiles, and most notably, of course, auger bits. And in fact, it was because of the Russell Jennings Company that Chester became known as the auger bit capital of the world. And I watch on PBS, the Woodwright Shop. Anyone know that show? It's a guy who modern day practices old style non-power tool carpentry, and he'll all the time refer to Jennings bits. So they're that well known. Another noteworthy business in town was the Selma Company, which I believe was where the Terrace Theater was, right? So it was to the right of this picture.
Well, and actually also the building, the closest building was the dark, because it spanned the road.
Yeah. And you're going to hear more about that in a few minutes for a particular reason. And you'll also hear about the Brooks factory, which was established in 1848 for manufacturing screws and screw eyes. And that building still stands on Liberty Street. In the center of town, which is what we're looking toward here, with the hotel kind of being central to it. So there was the hotel, there was the Stone Store, which was the goods place of business for a long time. And obviously the hotel now is Leif Nielsen's studio, but obviously in a very different configuration. There were a few other stores, there was a post office. Around town, there was still a lot of agriculture, a lot of farms. So in a way, I think it's paradoxical that Chester was both more industrial and more rural than nowadays. So there was still a lot of open space, a lot of farming, but a lot of factories, a lot more factories than obviously today. So social life centered on religion, as was true in most of New England. So the town had three distinct religious communities. The oldest, of course, was the Congregational Church, which stood on West Main Street, and alongside it was the more recently established Baptist Church, and of course today's United Church is the physical joining of those two buildings. So it truly is united, literally and figuratively. And the Catholic Church had just been established in 1855 in its current location, but with a different building. Family connections were really important in those days, probably more so than nowadays. People supported each other in times of need. It was a very interconnected social network within the community. And one of the interesting things when you read the letters and diaries is this connection amongst people, and they're visiting each other all the time. In the evenings, instead of going home and watching TV, they're going and visiting people. And Nancy wrote about it almost every day in her diary, if you read through that. Visited so-and-so, visited so-and-so, they came to visit me. So it was a very interconnected community. And many of the names are still prominent today in town and are familiar. So, okay, so Rob's now going to talk about the Ayers family in particular. So more details about their family.
Okay, so on the left is Willis, and on the right is Nancy. The Ayers family came from, Aaron was their father, and he came from East Haddam. He was a quarryman. He worked in the quarries. And because of the bulk of quarries in Haddam at the time, he had moved to Haddam and worked in Haddam in the quarries, and that's where he met their mother, Nancy Dickinson. And then he moved down to work in the quarries in Chester. Specifically, I know he worked at the quarry that was down behind the Catholic Church on Railroad Avenue. Now, we don't know a lot about Willis. He was 27 years old when he entered the service. He was born in 1835. He never married. Nancy we know a little bit more about Nancy through her diary. We will learn more about Willis's sort of personality through his letters, which we will talk a little bit about, make some quotes from the letters. But anyway, Nancy was, she was 21 in 1863 at the time these letters were written, and she was single, and she had a very active,
Interest in the opposite sex.
well, I was going to say an active imagination, if nothing else,
Yeah, well,
in her romantic life. But we'll get to the end of her,
very proper way though, in a very proper way.
Yeah, we'll carry their lives as far as we can, but in order. So, all right, I took care of that. One of the things that well, this is the other side of the family, so I won't go into that right now. Well, I mean, it is part of the story, sort of, because it does, anyway. So, at the time of the war, the start of the war, both Nancy and Willis worked at Brooks's factory, which is just down the road. And that's about all we know about that. All right, I did that. In the home, oh, there's Brooks's factory. Now, this is actually if you look at the building now, this is the far east end of the building, the part furthest toward Pleasant Street. And so it was added on this side. And we know that because of the picture of the building that was next door that Tom Norton moved. It was a house, it was a Brooks house, and it was moved further over, but there were pictures that showed them in proximity because it was much closer. And anyway, that's just a way to identify where this is in the building that exists now, because the building now is much bigger. So the family lived, I forgot, oh, okay. Oh, no, which was first? I can.
Well, talk about
yeah. All right. So this completes the family of the surviving children. On the left is Hannah Temperance. That was her middle name. She was our great grandmother. And on the right is the younger brother Henry. So during the war, Hannah was 16 and Henry was 12 in 1863. And they lived. Well, wait, we'll go back 1 second. One of the funny things is now, I've heard many different ways that photographers came into town, or there were photographers in town, there were itinerant photographers. We do know that there were some resident photographers in town, but there were also itinerant ones that came around, and we learned a little bit about that. That they also went around the war, the army camps. But the picture on the left of Hannah, there is an identical picture of Nancy. Well, she's wearing the same outfit, so it's like they had, whether it was like the photographer had the dress-up clothes and you went in and picked what you wanted to wear, and they each chose, and it's the same background, so it's the same thing, but it's obviously a different person, which is kind of funny. Anyway, they lived on Main Street. They rented. And this house still exists. You may not recognize it because it's now wearing its Victorian garb in this picture. But this house is the second one from from Middlesex Avenue. On the corner is the doctor's office, and this is the next house. It's a rental property, and there are a couple of apartments in it. And I don't know whether they rented the whole house or part of the house, but that's where they lived. And so just to talk about their neighborhood. In 1863, on that side of the road, there were no other houses between the Wilcox house, which is the little cape right next to the post office, all the way up the hill. There were no other houses. It's questionable whether Chesterfields existed at the time. It would have been a much smaller house because a Wilcox did eventually buy it and expand it. But the only other building on that side of the road would have been the schoolhouse, which was directly opposite School Lane, where School Lane goes down. It was on the other side of the road, and that was, in 1863, it was 50 years old or so. It was built in 1816, 17, and right at the close of the war, 1865, they decided they needed a new school, and that's when the building on the corner of School Lane was built as a two-room schoolhouse, which is, it's still there, but it's been expanded. The upper floor was added. So that was that side of the road. The other side of the road, there were no houses. The Burr House was built, the house on the corner of School Lane was built in 1863, sometime during that year. And then going down the hill, it's not clear, I haven't, closed in a date other than the 1860s for the two little Victorian houses, and then there's a farmhouse. So those may or may not have been there. The house at the bottom of the hill where Michael Peck lives is not there. The yellow house across from the post office. And then the house directly across from the post office, they were not there at that time. Around the corner, the house where Virginia and Isaac Ruiz lived was there. This is on Middlesex Avenue. That house was there. Right next to that was the Pratt House. Across the street was the less than 10-year-old Catholic church that had just been built in 1855, this time he said. Which that building now is on the corner of Middlesex Avenue and Main Street, a style above. That was the original Catholic church, but it was on the other location. The house on the corner of Old Depot Road and Middlesex Avenue, which is my house, was there, and they were good friends with the Ayers family. But Nancy talks about in her diary, was it the diary or the letters? I can't remember now.
Not sure where you're going.
That there were no, she was lonely at times because there were no other people in her neighborhood. They had all gone off to war or they were somewhere else. So there weren't as many houses.
I think in
homes
both
and families
places
there.
she expresses that sentiment in both.
Okay.
Very poignant.
But we'll go into Nancy's,
Yeah, we'll do that later.
stuff later.
All right, ready?
Yep.
So we're going to turn now to the war, which is really the subject matter of this. So Chester in the Civil War, and Connecticut in the Civil War. So this is a regiment from Connecticut. It is not the one that Willis was in, but one very like it, of course. So Connecticut supplied 29 infantry regiments to the war and over 54,000 soldiers during the war years. And so the one that Willis and his friends were in was the 20th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. It was formed in Hartford in August of 1862. And so Willis and 10 other Chester boys enlisted, and their names are all up on that plaque, as well as all of the other Chester boys that served at all. So it's a fascinating thing to take a look at. There's a picture of it in the book. So the 20th Connecticut departed for Washington, D.C. on September 11th of 1862. Initially, its role was going to be just to aid in the defense of the capital city, because in those days, Washington, D.C., of course, was right on the border of the South, and they were always under threat of being attacked by the Confederates coming out of Virginia. But in May of that year, and so May of 1863, they made their way into Virginia, and over the days of the 2nd through the 6th, they participated in the Battle of Chancellorsville. So any one of you who is a Civil War buff or whatever, that was one of the major battles, and in fact, it is often noted as being probably the most dramatic victory by Robert E. Lee over the Unions in a situation where he was vastly overwhelmed in numbers, but it was a brilliant tactical victory, and unfortunately the 20th Connecticut was right at the brunt of it. So what happened was that this was a few months after the disaster at Fredericksburg, where the Union was basically a futile attack on entrenched troops in that town, and the Confederates retained that position, but with a new commander, Joe Hooker. He had a strategy where he was going to kind of circle around behind the Confederates, and he did that and occupied some ground in the vicinity of a crossroad called Chancellorsville. And so Lee was facing him, and he was vastly outnumbered, and Lee was not stupid enough to attack an entrenched line the way that the Union did in those days. So he had this, audacious plan to take, he was already outnumbered like 2-1. He further divided his troops and did a flanking movement to his left and around the right of the Union forces, which they saw was, as they call it, hanging in the air, meaning it was not defended on its far right, and that's exactly where the 20th Connecticut had been positioned. And many years ago, my family and our sons went down there. We took a trip to Virginia, and we went to the battlefield of Fredericksburg. We went to Chancellorsville. We talked to the ranger there. We were able to walk on the field. They were able to pinpoint exactly where various regiments were positioned, so we were able to walk that ground. We got some maps that showed, almost minute by minute, the movement of the troops. And so there's a couple of maps that I reproduced in the book that showed sort of the climactic moments of that battle. But what happened was that Lee sent Stonewall Jackson, his most famous general, on a flanking movement. They came in behind the Union troops on the morning of May 3rd in the surprise attack, and they overwhelmed the Union right, and then basically they rolled up the entire line, and the Union had to retreat. Willis and many of his friends were captured. And so they spent the next, so from May until September, those who were captured were in what they call a parole camp. And I'll tell you about that in a second. So this is Willis, that in a picture was taken, as Rob said. There were lots of photographers that traveled around in the camps and took pictures. So Willis had this picture taken. So it's one of only the two that we have of him. You saw the earlier one, which we think was after the war, although he only lived 2 years, so it must have been right after the war, but this clearly was him in uniform. And Nancy actually talks about receiving this photograph, and she kind of makes fun of his big boots in that letter. It's kind of amusing. After the capture, Willis and a few of his comrades, I guess I didn't put the convalescent camp. So I'll talk about that later, about what happened in the capture and the aftermath and all of that. Okay, so.
You can leave that, because I'm gonna read her quote now.
Okay, so we'll go to the letters now. So Willis wrote all but one of his letters while he was a prisoner during that several month span. So, I think it's fortuitous for us in two ways that he was captured. One, it spared him from later engagements, including Gettysburg, because the 20th Connecticut was engaged at Gettysburg during his captivity. And secondly, it gave him time to write. And so he had plenty of time to write these letters, and they are very detailed. I'm going to read an excerpt from one that talks about his capture, and it's quite detailed and it's fascinating, but also the camp life and lots of things. And so one of the things we did on our trip to Chancellorsville is we had made Xerox copies of the letters, and we left them with I took them and handed them to them, I think. And they put them in their archives so that for any researchers in the future you never know what you're going to learn from these individual reminiscences and descriptions, because you read a book about these battles, and I've read 2 or 3 about this battle. It's always like from a very high level of elevation, the larger tactics and strategy, but you don't get the individual soldier's perspective, which is very different, and that's what these letters talk about. So letters.
So I had also gone down to Chancellorsville and talked to the guy at the Chancellorsville Historic Site and told him about the letters, and I was like a little embarrassed, because I said, these letters are really, you can read them, the grammar's not that good, the spelling's not that good. And he said, that is the way the letters were, and as Tommy said, that's how they learned, the historians, that's how they learned about specific aspects of each battle, and anything that happened is they learned it primarily from letters that people had written back and forth. And so he said, would you give us copies? And of course we said yes. Well, I wanted to leave that.
Okay,
So
so
I'm going to read her quote.
Okay.
But I want to talk about the letters first, the aspects of editing.
Well, I can go back to it.
Sorry. Well, all right, whatever. So as we talked about, reproducing these letters, there was a big discussion. Now, you've got a college professor and a kindergarten teacher, looking at the two ends of these letters. The letters are, the spelling is very phonetic. So to me, it was like, it's no problem. But to the college professor, it's like, yeah, people aren't going to be able to read those. So we went back and forth about how much editing to actually do, and keep the same flavor of the letters that, keep them in their truest form. So we did consult with a variety of people, you know, Diane and Carrie and Lal and Sam
And Al,
and Al,
Malpa.
you know, just, and you know, so
So I lost that.
so he lost it, and they are in their purest state. There were just a minor editing that we did, adding a word that was obviously missing, or correct spelling of a word that, you know, you might not have been able to phonetically sound out. But it was interesting, and you know, the hard thing about it is reading the letters the first time. They're not that interesting, or you're bogged down in trying to read them. But the more you read them, it's amazing what you get out of them. You know, you get to know the people, you get to know their senses of humor, you get to know, you know, it was amazing.
They become real people.
Yeah.
And here's a sample of, I mean, look at the
That's
This is
Willis's writing. You'll notice his writing is much neater than hers. But I mean, it's like perfect.
there was line paper, so we did have lines.
Faintly, and very faintly lined. Yeah. But again, there are some real letters over there, and the diaries, of course. But anyway, so just to put in the plug for Chester before I read the quote from Nancy about the big boots. The two inkwells are pocket inkwells that were patented here in Chester and became, well, part of the letter that I'm going to read I'm going to read two parts of this letter. One talks about the fact that the telegraph was cut off, the powers that be cut off the telegraph because there was too much information going back and forth that was helping or hurting or whatever. So the letters home became, you know, the main conduit for information about the battle and people and everything. But because of Silliman and Sons Company in Chester, which was the only place that you could get these pocket inkwells, they allowed soldiers to carry them without ink spilling. And they were patented here in Chester, and they were given to all the soldiers, or purchased for all the soldiers. So, and these two were there two different styles there. These were family pieces, so they could have been, as we'll find out, the brother-in-law, or they could have been Willis's, because the brother-in-law became our great-great-grandfather.
Also, this was the first war in which the vast majority, especially the northern troops, were literate, had been in school. And so that was also, as poor as the grammar and spelling is, it's still, you know, and if you'd gone back just a few years, they would have been illiterate, and there would have been no letters. So it really was the combination of the inkwells and the literacy that led to the vast, you know, amount of correspondence that came out of this war. And so we know so much more about detail than, so say, Revolutionary War, for example.
And the other dilemma that, not our dilemma, but a dilemma of written documents like the diaries and the letters. You know, there are two schools of thought about why they were preserved, should they be preserved. And you know, with Al's consultation, it was like, you know, he made it clear that letters, because photographs were not that common, and because distance, you know, if you're anything you got from someone far away, that, especially in a war that you may never see them again, anything that you had of them was precious. You know, so it sort of counters that thought, destroy anything that, you know, any of my written documents before I, you know, when I die. And then, you know, you think about the diaries. Were the diaries written for catharsis, or were they written for posterity? You know, you go back and forth on that. So there's that, you know, balance or thought process about it. But anyway, the letters, I think the letters show a lot more humor than I might have expected. I don't know if you feel the same way, but you know, you sort of picture these somber, but there's a lot of humor and a lot of playfulness. So anyway, I'm going to read two quotes from a letter from May 5th, 1863. This is from Nancy. It is at this time I take my pen in hand to write to you. We are all well, and hope and trust this will find you the same, but I fear not. I suppose you are now engaged in battle. And again, this was what you said, May 3rd, the
So
battle
this was
or
written
5th.
after
The
the
battle
battle
was
had
the
already
3rd.
taken place.
Yeah, so again, she didn't know. Oh, that you are spared. We know not whether you are fighting or suffering on the battlefield. We look and hope for the best. We can't hear the correct news, for the government has cut off telegraph. It is to stop these northern rebels informing the South of what is going on in the North. I think it is a very good plan. The news today are that the rebels are retreating from Fredericksburg. I feel better to think that you hold up such good courage. It is half that helps you along. It is a good thing to have courage. I'm afraid this letter will never reach you, for I fear you will not be in the land of the living. If you are, it will be through the providence of the Almighty, the ruler of men and nations. So then in the same letter, she goes on, I received a letter from you last week with your picture and was much pleased that you was so well and seemed to be in such good spirits. You wanted me to see if that picture looked much like, you wanted me to see if that picture looked much like the other. There is quite a contrast between the two, which makes me wonder if the other picture was indeed before the war. You would be shocked to see them together. It don't look as you used to. I presume it is a good picture of you now. Your necktie was tied natural, and your eyes and nose was very natural. And that is all I can see. And those big boots is what I looked at. So there's, playfulness, humor, and,
All right, that other letter I showed you, that's a Nancy example. So still really, really nice. Not quite as skillful as her brother, but by today's standards, very nice. So do you want me to read mine now?
yeah.
Okay. All right. So first of all, this is just a map showing the route that the 20th Connecticut took from Washington. They went down through Fredericksburg and into Chancellorsville. The two rivers there, the main river is the Rappahannock, and the branch that goes off up, I think the one that's the lower branch is the Rapidan.
Yeah. So
they went around and came into Chancellorsville by crossing both of those rivers, and he'll talk about it. So I'm going to read a somewhat lengthy description. When he had plenty of time, he settled into this camp, and he wrote to Nancy. So May 19th, 1863. Dear sister, I now have plenty of time to write, and I will tell you something about the battle. We left Stafford Courthouse Monday, April 27th. The boys were all in good spirits. We crossed the Rapidan River at Kelly's Ford at 6 o'clock. We had a little skirmish with some rebels, 2 of our men killed, but we took about 60 of theirs prisoner. We got to a place called Chancellorsville and camped for the night in the woods. Sam Fargo and I had to go on picket duty. I had just got some coffee boiled when there was a big volley of musketry within about 30 rods of us, and so we had to form a quick line of battle. Some of the boys were very excited and looked as if their last day had come, but I did not think any more of it than if I had been out hunting birds. There was hard fighting all around us, but they did not get to where we were. We slept with our guns and were called up several times in the night. The next morning, we commenced to throw up breastworks. The shot and shell was flying in all directions around us. It was a sight to see. The shells go and burst in the air. There was a continued roar, and the shells and shots was coming through our breastwork and wounding and killing our men. After a while, they came up, and we cut one of their regiments to pieces, and they fell back. But they got through the regiment to our left and got into our rear, and so they was all around us. Our regiment was mostly gone, but I kept shooting the damn rebels. The bullets was flying as thick as bees swarming. One bullet went through Sam Jagger's cap, and one rebel said, "Surrender and drop your gun." But I couldn't see it, so I brought up my gun, and he dropped to the ground and never got up. But before I could load my gun again, another said, "Drop it or I will shoot you." And so I had to give up. Sam Fargo and Sam Jagger was also taken. Ed Gardner was wounded and couldn't walk. Another in our company was wounded. A bullet went in one side of his face and out the other, close to his ear. I saw 2 or 3 dead, and 18 of our company was taken prisoner. If you know of any that was killed or wounded, I wish you would let me know. Willis. So after the capture, Union prisoners, so prisoner exchange in those days, in the early years of the war, neither side wanted to expend resources to guard prisoners and feed them and so on, so they arranged for exchanges, basically 1 for 1. but if there was a surplus of one side, they had to go into what was called a parole camp and sort of on their honor, promise not to go back into battle. It's astonishing that that system seemed to work for a while, but by the end of the war, they had kind of given up on it. I think the South had gotten so desperate that they were unwilling to return any prisoners, and that's when these horrific prison camps like Andersonville sprang up. But in the earlier years, exchange was the main way they dealt with prisoners. And so Willis and his comrades were in this parole camp, and it was in Annapolis, Virginia, and this is the camp. This is a Library of Congress photograph of the camp where Willis likely was housed during much of this time. They were actually being guarded by their own troops. So it was really an honor system. Now, Sam Fargo apparently went AWOL from this and came home. I don't know if you're going to talk much about it, but he obviously skipped out, but at least he didn't go back into battle. He just wanted out, and Willis got kind of annoyed about that, as we find in the letters. He lost some respect for his comrade Sam as a result of that. So I mentioned about the stunning Confederate victory at Chancellorsville and the role that Stonewall Jackson played in that. He was the one that led the flanking march, and he had planned the dawn attack on the 3rd. Unfortunately for him, he went out on a scouting mission the night before on May 2nd, and he was returning to his lines. His own men fired on him, and he was wounded and then died several days later from pneumonia. So the Confederates lost one of their most important generals, and the Union troops learned about this fairly quickly, and they were actually quite happy about it because they knew how impactful Stonewall Jackson was. And so I'll just read one more short excerpt from the letter. This is Stonewall here. One more short excerpt. So he wrote, "The rebels say they will fight as long as they can get 3 men, but I don't see it. I don't think so, as the death of old Stonewall is a hard blow to them. I see it stated in their papers that he was as good as 50,000 men, but he is gone now. I had a Richmond paper that had it all in it concerning his death and burial, but someone stole it. Too bad. I wish he'd brought it home. That would be, an amazing document to have." Okay, so you already did Nancy. Do you want to read some more? Okay.
Yeah, well, there is I did mark a quote about Sam Fargo that I wanted to read.
Okay, so again, Nancy's letter.
So she says, Sam Fargo has gone up the river. Now this is after he left parole camp and came home. He shouldn't have. Sam Fargo has gone up, and so there was a little sort of, what word shall I use about Sam Fargo?
Romantic triangle?
It was a little, yeah, she had a fancy for him.
It's very cute.
And so it changed over the course of this year, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, so she says, so he was a topic of their letters, aside from the fact that he was a local guy. Sam Fargo has gone up the river to work in a pistol shop, so I hear. Cold? Maybe? That's me saying that, not them. There's such talk that he will be married before long. I hope so. And so this is her sending now information that he didn't have, that Willis didn't have. I will send you the list of the drafted men in Chester, and we'll send you my picture in this. And then she goes on to say, do you think it's a good one of me? I don't know any more to write this time. She's now talking about her little brother. Henry's gone to New York on the vessel with William Dickinson, again a relative. He's gone to work as a cook. He started today. I should have wrote to you before, but E.L. Chappell, the neighbor, Enoch wrote Sunday, and I thought I would wait a few days. So there's a combination of, war information, plus there's the local, gossipy stuff. This is, and one of the cool things about this is reading the phrases or the sayings that they were common in the day, I guess. Like, this one, is this the one? Yeah. This is a quote, this is a quote from Hannah's letter, his 16-year-old sister, September 16th, 1863, which actually ended up being her wedding date 3 years later. Dear brother, it is at this time I seat myself to let you know that I am well and hope that these few lines, and again, the name of the book came from, and I think this is kind of funny, he had already read through the letters, and said, this is what we're going to name the book. And I read it separate. I read through the letter separately. I said, hey, I got a good name for the book. And we both said these few lines, because they repeat these few lines. Anyway, ruining this quote here. Let me find my place again. All right, it is at this time I seek myself to let you know that I am well and hope these few lines will find you the same. There's not much news in Chester to write that would be interesting to you. I am to work in the shop now, and that's Brooks's. But there's no work today, so I thought I could improve some of the time in writing to you. That was a phrase that kept repeating. I will improve the time by, and I thought that was kind of a neat quote. There's another quote.
The school marm one?
Yeah, that's the one I want to read. This is just a quick quote. Now, this is something that I heard that my mother or grandmother would actually refer to. They may not have said it, but they referred to it. And so this is a letter from Nancy, and she's tired of it. Well, actually, I'm going to read part of the rest of it. Again, this is local news, and this is a really interesting fact about Chester history. And this is, she's going to refer to Laurel Hill Cemetery. Should I leave that out?
No, put it in.
There's not much news in Chester. Noah Gladwin was buried last Wednesday. He had drank till he has killed himself. He was out to church Sunday, and in the afternoon, sorry, I'm ruining this quote. I'm going to start again. Anyway, Noah Gladwin is actually Noah Gladding. They were very,
There wasn't someone with that name, and I think she confused them.
Well, again, they were very funny with names. If you read through the book, if you notice, Nancy is spelled two different ways. Ayers is spelled two different ways. On his gravestone, his name is spelled incorrectly over in the cemetery. So it's like names are, ethereal things that just sort of... Anyway, so there's not much news in Chester. Noah Gladwin was buried last Wednesday. He had drank till he has killed himself. He was out to church Sunday in the afternoon, and Tuesday morning he was a corpse. He was buried over on the new cemetery, the first one that is laid there. I cannot think of any more to write at this time. I am so sleepy. I feel as though I did not care whether school kept on or not, as long as the school marm is there. And so goodbye for this time. So that phrase, I did not care whether school kept or not, as long as the school marm was there. That's a phrase that, again, we heard our grandmother or mother refer to that comment. There was another quote I wanted to read from, all right, this is from Nancy. This is in September, the following day. Dear brother, I have just received a letter from you stating that you was well, glad to hear it, and requesting me to send you $5. I am as well as usual, and all the rest of us. I have received that check from your state bounty and have sent it to New Haven this morning, and shall expect the money by tomorrow night. How I wish I could just stop in your camp place and see you, and see what kind of a place you've got. I don't think I would want to stay very long. I should like to see you. It is now about a year since I received the first letter from you. How is Sam Jagger getting along? Did you ever send them clothes that you talked of sending? There is a dance to the hotel tonight. Some folks seem to enjoy themselves if it is war times. Henry has not got home yet, and Mother does worry a good deal about him. We some expected him today. I expect he will have some pretty big stories to tell when he does come. I will send you $5 in this. I have not much news to write tonight. Hannah wrote yesterday, you must excuse this short letter for this time. I will bid you good night. Yours truly, from Nancy, your sister. Now, the other thing that we know from the diary is that they did correspond throughout the war. We just don't have those letters. So this was not a limited time thing. We just sadly don't have the letters.
I thought you were going to refer to that closing in one of her letters where she said, your sister, Nancy, do you know her? I mean, it was very cute and,
Playful.
girlish thing that she was saying. And I just found that, amazing. The romantic triangle we refer to, this is who we think is the third, the other apex of that triangle.
Which just happened to be in our family album.
Yeah, so Rob had a family album and it referred to Nell Russell. That's the name, the caption. And the person referred to in the letters is Ellen Russell. So it's almost certainly the same person. But, Nancy, early on in the letters would often say, give my regards to my friend Sam Fargo. I would do so if I weren't afraid to, or something like that. And then it kind of escalated a little bit, and then he comes home and he starts going around with this girl. And Willis had to, and you know, Willis asked about that, and she said, yeah, he's with his dear Ellen, you know, that kind of thing. It was very cute. All right. So, diaries. So this is a picture, the open one is Nancy's diary, the closed one again also had a diary, but
They were exactly the same, except
yeah,
one was
and
red
you
one
can
was
see,
black.
you know, that it's written in pencil, it's very short entries, most of it is very mundane stuff. You know, the weather, I went to see so-and-so today, that sort of thing. It's really not that interesting until you get to
Certain parts.
certain parts. So let me just read. April 14th, 1865. Pleasant today, at home, to meeting in the afternoon, called to Mrs. Parker's, Mrs. Johnson's, Mr. Churchill's. To meeting in the evening. President Lincoln was murdered today. It's like,
And that was the day he was shot, not the day he died.
so that had to have been put in later, because she couldn't have possibly known he was murdered, because he didn't die until the 15th, the morning of the 15th. So she certainly read it in the paper, probably went back to that day, and filled in that. And then, a few days later, April 19th. Pleasant today, at home, went to the store in the evening, to meeting and called to Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Wilcox, Mrs. Clark, Mr. Chappell. To meeting in the evening. And then up above, the end, up above, because there's no room left, she writes, Mr. Lincoln funeral today. So, I found it striking that for the first, so the war went until April of 1865. There was not a single mention of it in those weeks.
Except maybe getting a letter from Willis.
Occasionally you say, you know, got a letter from Willis today, but you didn't say, you know, he was, you know, nothing about the surrender, nothing about any celebrations of the surrender, which almost certainly would have happened in April of 1865. So my interpretation of that is that it had become such a background noise, kind of like the pandemic nowadays, that she got tired of thinking about it and talking about it and just didn't say anything. Because, you know, she was trying to put it out of her mind as best she could, but certain events you just can't leave out. And thank God for that, right? So, all right. So, there's Lincoln. All right,
Well, I
we're
was,
almost done.
I
Almost
have
done.
a couple of things I wanted to say that were interesting in the diary.
Okay.
Just historically interesting. And
True.
so she talks about, we know that during the war she worked at Brooks's factory, but in October of that year, she stopped working in October, went off visiting family in East Haddam for, you know, a week or so in East Haddam, and then came back in December and she started working at one of the shoddy mills out west, and mentions that. One of the cool things about, you know, it was at this time in the 1860s where they're experimenting, this is something he should be telling about, not me, but experimenting with different kinds of power to run the factories. And so she does comment at various times, no work today because the water's too low, because they were using water power. And then one day she comments, no work today, the water's low, or to work today, the water's low, but they're going to experiment with new steam power.
So they had a backup steam power, and it was just coming in, and I actually went and did some research, and it was just at that time, and so there's a footnote that gives some details about that for the nerds in the group. So, you know, the water flow was unpredictable, and if it was low, the wheel wouldn't turn, there wasn't enough power to drive the wheel, they had to shut down work, so they were just putting in steam engines to serve as a backup. And so that's the bit of information that was in the diary, and, you know, for economic historians, you know, invaluable bit of information.
And on the same subject is the fact that, despite the fact that she had a, you know, what we would think of as a 9-to-5 job every day, or 8 to 4, or 7 to 3, whatever, 7 to 4, she seemed to have flexibility to stay home and do laundry one day, or stay home and not on the days that there was no work. So, and talk about the research you did about that.
Well, there's another footnote, I don't remember what exactly was the point, but it did say that, with the coming of industrialization, there had to be some amount of regimented work and a schedule, because much of the work required everyone to be there to coordinate their activities, but there still was a fair amount of flexibility allowed for home life, and we call it flex time now, and it seemed to be a fairly common thing back then. And I had this book about early industrialization in New England, and one of the comments there was exactly that. There was a fair amount of it was partly for morale purposes, which I think we can all relate to. We need some break time. And it was partly just because of the necessities of day-to-day life that they had to allow people to take care of household chores and so on. So it was very interesting.
Also in the diaries, it illustrates, what he was saying about the community-ness of everybody back then, because at the beginning of the year of 1865, Aaron Ayres, their father, was not well. It's not clear what was wrong with him. He did not die. We know that because he didn't die till many years later. But it was clear that they had community members, neighbors, people that came and sat with him every night of the week. And she would list exactly who sat with him that night, while he was, convalescing. And it was several weeks. So it was kind of interesting to see. It wasn't always family. It was rarely family. It was, the neighbors or, people, somebody from Deep River came up. So that was kind of interesting. And then we also saw, part of the Nancy that we learned about becoming, the flirtatious girl. Is this the right time to tell this part?
I guess so.
Well, all right. Well, let me talk about. All right. Let me go back to. This is our great-great-grandfather, and he enlisted in the Army from Pennsylvania, which is where he came from, and served his term. Was discharged. I couldn't think of the word. He was discharged in Pennsylvania, and then he came up to Connecticut because his sister worked in the hotel. And so he wanted to be near her. And then, for what reason, because of the, fervor of war, he enlisted in the Navy from Chester. And so he and a friend, Jeremiah Wilcox, time to do stories together.
Yeah, do it.
He and Jeremiah Wilcox went down to New Haven to enlist in the Navy. And because of situation, which is not clear, they were not allowed to come back. They had to report directly. So from our great-great-uncle, George, we find out that, and it was convoluted the way he said it, because apparently at that time, Jeremiah, the man that Harry went with, was sweet on Nancy, and
So she'd gotten over Sam, in other words.
she'd gotten over Sam
and moved on
quickly
to
enough,
Jeremiah.
and moved on to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah actually died within a month of enlisting, and you suspected it may have been
It was
through
disease.
disease. But Uncle George says he died of a broken heart because he was not able to come back and say goodbye to his sweetheart in Chester. But that's not a sad part of the story, because then we go on later in the year, and when the boys came back from the war, Harry came back,
She recovered
Willis
quickly.
came back, she recovered quickly, and another guy that was in the Army was J.L. Abbey, James Abbey. And so he would come over.
Also in the 20th Connecticut, whose name was up there.
Okay, so he
He
was
came
with
back with
Willis.
Willis.
And, he'd come a-calling, and they'd go to church meetings, or they'd go to this, to that. And then in the diary, she says twice that they were engaged. Now, it's unclear, if that's the traditional term, engaged.
Well, because the second time she said, we renewed our engagement. So,
But we know of no ring, we know
no
of
mention of a
no
ring,
marriage, we
yeah,
know.
no mention of a date or anything.
And so we did find out through the scrapbook, the Chester scrapbook, that,
But we know she never married, so clearly something happened there also. So he had a third, heartbreak.
she was busy. And so we know that J.L. Abbey married someone else and became a prominent member of the, citizen in town.
And she died a spinster. Unfortunately, sadly. It's funny that she always referred to him as J.L. Abbey. She never said Jim or Jane. It was always J.L. Abbey here tonight till 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever. You know, it was amazing how late these folks were staying up, and I don't know if they were chaperoned or what, but you know, use your imagination.
Mom and Dad were in the house.
Yeah, but probably long asleep. You know, in the parlor. You know, with my gentleman friend.
But anyway, so at the same time, Harry, William Henry, Harry Epwright, was acquainting himself with Nancy's sister, her younger sister, Hannah.
18 in 1865.
And so quite often in the diaries mentioned, Hannah and friend Harry accompanied us to the meeting, whatever. Hannah and friend Harry did this. We were accompanied by friend Harry, and so he became a member of our family.
So they actually did get married.
They got married September 16th, 1866.
These are our great-great-grandparents.
And Harry worked at a number of factories in the area, but he ended up at Jennings, and he and the Epwright legacy apparently is they were amazing and well-known polishers. I just learned that from listening to a oral history of a guy that was one of the last managers of Jennings. But I didn't realize they were just the Epwrights were the polishers, the polishers. It was kind of neat. And somebody else told me that Jennings bits were known for their polishedness. Other factories didn't make them as polished.
So he did lose an eye in an industrial accident, not a war accident. So that's why it looks kind of odd there.
Yeah, the older pictures of him, it's a side view, so you don't see the other eye.
All right. So I guess we're at the epilogue. And what happened to these folks? What happened to these folks? So I'll tell about Willis, and then Rob will tell about Nancy, and if we have any interest, we can answer questions. So Willis was exchanged in September of 1863, finally, went back to his regiment. As I said, they had in the meantime participated in Gettysburg, although they had been so decimated at Chancellorsville that apparently they were not in the thick of the fighting at Gettysburg. Only a couple, I think, casualties in the company. But he did participate in several other engagements, and we do list in the book the various engagements of the 20th Connecticut. Unfortunately, we have no letters from that time period. We know they existed because the diary referred to her receiving letters from Willis in 1865, but none of them for some reason survived, so we don't have any first-hand accounts. The tragedy is he survived the war and was killed in a railroad accident in 1867, so he only lived 2 more years, and he's buried in the cemetery just over there.
But I have to interject how we know this.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, no, so that is very prominent. It's probably closest to the road. You easily see it when you drive by. But notice the spelling of his name. Not the way he often signed it, although sometimes he did it that way and sometimes he didn't. And up on the plaque, it's A-Y-E-R-S. So that's one of those kind of conundrums about name spelling and so on. So why don't you tell about?
All right.
So this is a funny story.
Now, when we started, being interested in Willis and Nancy. Now, the other interesting thing is Nancy's stone I remember Nancy's stone being right next to it, but it no longer exists. So I don't know in the last 20, 30 years what happened to it. But anyway, I went through the town records to find out what happened to Willis, what happened to Nancy. And oddly enough, he died in 1867. Oddly enough, there are no death records for 1867 in Chester. The records are not there. So we had no idea how he died, where he died.
At only age 32, as you can see there.
Yeah. And so for years I was, trying to find out and had no way to find out. So several years ago, when my mother and Sherry Ferrari and I were doing a cemetery tour of these 2 cemeteries, Sherry said to me, I had mentioned, this is one of the stones right on the road. And so I'd mentioned it to her early on in our research. And so she came back one day and she said, I found out how your relative died. She said, and I love this. She says, we have a book of the, my family has this book of the dead, and, which I just, I just love that. And so in that book, it said that he died on the railroad, and we learned that he worked on the railroad, and he died in an accident on the railroad, which is kind of sad, making it through the Civil War and then dying on the railroad.
So what about Nancy?
All right, so Nancy, we don't know much about afterward, but she did, I do know that my grandmother would tell me that when Nancy was old, she lived in Chester on the corner of Osling Lane and Spring Street. And she died in 1902, and I didn't even think about this until today, but my grandmother would say that her older brother, who was 14 years older than her, would keep an eye on Aunt Nancy. He would, take care of her or look after her. And he was just a young kid. And so I realized, as I'm thinking about this, that at that time, because my grandmother grew up on Pleasant Street, but didn't move there until she said she thinks about 3. Before that, they lived across the street. But then they lived on Spring Street, where Midge Beecher lives. And so that's where the family lived. So they were neighbors. And that's why Uncle Lou took care of her, because they were neighbors. But we don't know, and I still don't know how much of this is true, but my grandmother said that because my grandmother had a chair that was Aunt Nancy's, and it was on casters, she said it was her wheelchair. Yet, I don't, now I think about it, it's like, was it just a chair on casters, or because she died before my grandmother was born, she didn't know her. So I don't know whether that part of the story is true, that she became an invalid. I don't know. But we just know that she never married and lived out her life, and she died at, what is it,
60 something.
Oh, yeah, I wrote it down, but I don't know where I wrote it. But anyway, so, what is it? Is that the last slide?
This is the last one.
So, Harry and Hannah got married and lived, and the interesting thing is, about them and the Civil War and, connections, is Harry and Hannah bought a house on Bochum Road. And they bought it from Joanna Fox, whose husband was killed in the war, and his name is up there. I can't remember if it's
Richard or Edward?
Yeah, I think it's Edward. But anyway, he was a Civil War veteran. He was killed in the war, and they bought the house from her. And the house had an interesting Chester history, because it was built in the center of town as a tin factory, where the Flatiron building is now, the green Helene Johnson's studio. It was built there, and then it was washed off the foundation by a spring freshet. It was rebuilt on Bochum Road, and then the Foxes lived there. They were the ones that moved it, I believe, and then Harry and Hannah bought it, and that's where they raised their family, which was our great-grandmother.
So that's Harry, third
Oh,
from the left.
sorry.
This is 1910 Civil War veterans, Chester and Deep River, and Harry is the third from the left. So, and that's all. So, thank you. So we'll answer any questions if people are interested, or,
Or we'll just leave.
yeah, Skip,
So neither was or Nancy married?
that's correct. That's correct,
Too bad.
yes.
And the other sister that lived, do I have the right family? Yeah, the other sister that lived didn't have children. She married but didn't have children. And then your grandfather was a brother.
Yeah.
So,
We have Harry's discharge papers from the Navy
oh, okay,
at home.
nice,
I'll get, we'll get it done.
thank you.
Well, we'll hang around if anyone,
Oh, yes, so we will sign copies. Jan and Peter Good are here to send copies of their amazing new book, Ephemera, which if you haven't seen, is beautiful. It has a lot of
Well,
images from
we were so
Chester.
impressed with it, we used the same printer.
Yeah, that's true.
And they did a
That's
good
true.
job on ours too, but
Thank you, Gary.
it's not as artistic as your guys' book.
Yeah, yours is beautiful.
Thank you.
You can tell we really care about this, that, you know.
And cut.
We'll